everyone, so today I get to showcase the final iteration of my poison imbuement build that I had been building for honestly about 4 weeks now through the review build process and even before that as well. Now, I've seen this compete and do better than things like the Werewolf Tornado, the bar builds out there. Overall, this is just an insane single target DPS build, oftentimes ticking for multiple millions of poison damage each poison tick, while also adding hundreds of thousands of consistent crit DPS, potentially millions every second. That said, let's dive into the skills. As always, the build link will be in the description down below if you guys want to follow everything exactly. Starting off with the basic though, a lot of you already know how strong Puncture is, and because we're playing a melee build, well, I'm going to take advantage of it. It basically gives us permanent vulnerable uptime whenever we want it. We cast it, we get vulnerable as long as we're roughly mid to melee range. This is a key skill. It's also going to proc some of our aspects and give us the marksman skill trigger, which is pretty important later on. The namesake of this build is actually Twisting Blades. It's the Twisting Blades Poison Imbuement build, and despite the many nerfs to advanced Twisting Blades, it's still oftentimes better to run than basically any of the other skills from what I've seen in terms of single target DPS, okay? However, there is option to go with improved Twisting Blades, although that changes around your build quite a bit. I prefer advanced Twisting Blades still because the cooldown reduction is still very good if you're able to combo with a lot of your mobility options, which we're going to be running Shadow Step and Dash. Now, with Shadow Step, we're running this mainly because it's a CC break. This is something that a lot of people do not know, but when you use this, you actually break CC. This is the core CC break that the Rogue has, and with the cooldown reduction you're getting from advanced Twisting Blades, and if you're going to run, let's say, Disciplined Shadow Step, you're going to get a lot of CC break potential. It depends on where I'm going, but Methodical Shadow Step or Disciplined Shadow Step can be good. And then I'm going to pick up Dash from my boots here and get some ranks towards Dash so I can move that skill point towards another area of the game, okay? This is another really nice movement speed ability for Nightmare Dungeon clearing and overall moving around the game, but you can make some minor modifications to certain areas of the game. Now we jump into our imbuement slot, which is Poison Imbuement. We're also going to go with Blended Poison Imbuement for the critical strike damage, increasing our poisoning damage. And then lastly, we have Shadow Clone. This is going to be a very important one to really amp up our single target damage when we pop it, okay? Our key passive is going to be Momentum in order for us to get some extra energy regeneration, damage reduction, and movement speed. When you go ahead and use something like Shadow Step, you're going to guarantee refresh / guarantee reapply the stack of momentum because you have to hit an enemy that's stunned, dazed, or frozen, or hit any enemy from behind, and Shadow Step always hits someone from behind, okay? Now, a couple things about this. There's a few other things that I want to mention, particularly a bunch of damage amping bonuses, but one key passive here is going to be Siphoning Strikes. Since we're going to be close to enemies, this is going to give us like infinite healing as long as we're able to stay in the fight, which is going to be really powerful. It's not quite as good on this build as it is on Death Trap build, but it's still very good. And then the next passive I'm going to be going with is Concussive and Trick Attacks. We're going to have an aspect that is going to daze enemies, and when we critical strike a dazed enemy, we're going to knock them down, and then that's going to trigger Concussive, which is going to give us extra critical strike chance, which is going to be really useful for clearing out a lot of the ads in this game. That's the skills. Let's dive into the gear. Now, I'll mention this really quickly, but Harlequin Crest is going to be the absolute awesome best helmet for basically every build, but there's like one or maybe two out there in the whole world right now, so I don't add it to my builds quite yet. But in terms of the first aspect we're going to be running, it's going to be Mangler's Aspect. This gives us the lucky hit chance whenever we deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, we have a 45% chance to daze them. This is going to allow us to trigger that Concussive and Trick Attacks and to be a nice combo, and overall just get a little bit of CC out there for some potential additional stagger break. On the chest piece, we have the Aspect of Might to give us extra damage reduction with our Puncture, which is going to be really nice. On the gauntlets or gloves here, we're going to have the Corruption aspect to give our imbuement skill additional increased potency against vulnerable enemies. Since we have permanent vulnerability, this is going to be all the time. Now, I will mention a quick kind of swap you can make. On the crossbow, we have the Twisting Blades Blade Dancer aspect. You could actually make a swap potentially here, and with the amulet, which we'll talk about in just a second. The pros to running the Corruption aspect on the crossbow here is that Well, you'll get significantly more effectiveness out of your poison imbuement, especially when you're running your shadow clone as well, and you're going to get typically a little bit less AoE damage. Corruption aspect, if I had a better roll, I'd actually run it on the crossbow. But unfortunately, I have not picked up a better roll, and so I'm not running it at the current moment. But if you have a max roll, I definitely recommend putting it on the crossbow in order to get the 2 times effectiveness. Now, with that said, the Blade Dancer aspect is incredibly important, even if you're going to run the Corruption on the crossbow, and I'd swap it over to the gloves. This allows you to give the Poison Imbuement AoE DPS, which is really, really powerful. Pants, we have Temerity. A lot of people are using Temerity. This is pretty simple. It's just going to give you a ton of extra shielding. If they decide to nerf this, will this build work? Yes, you'll just be a little bit less tanky, so I recommend running some other tanky aspect on your pants. Boots, we're going to run the Ravager's aspect for additional charge of Shadow Step. This is going to give us extra mobility and also giving us an additional charge of our CC break. Amulet, we're going to run the Chain of Disobedience, or the aspect of Disobedience. Now, this one really depends on what your armor value is. It also depends on kind of how you're going to play the build. But running it on the amulet because it allows us to stack the armor value extremely, extremely quickly, because you can gain up to 75 or 0.75% extra armor for 4 seconds, up to 75%. However, you're not oftentimes going to get up to that 75%, so it's nice to run the amulet so you can get some extra armor and get some more value there. However, if you're able to stack it quickly and get the maximum value of armor, which is when this says reduces physical damage taken from enemies of equal level by 100%, you might want to run it on, let's say, the chest piece or the helmet or whatever, and then swap some aspects around in order for that to work. First ring, we're going to run the Bursting Venoms aspect, and this is super important for your single target damage. When we critically strike with poison imbued skills and we get the lucky hit trigger, we have a 10% chance to create a poison field. And when you're standing in the poison field, it does a little bit of damage, but the damage really doesn't matter. It's about the effect. And when we stand in that pool, we're going to get infinite poison imbuement. Infinite poison imbuement. Let me say that again. That is crazy. Guess what that happens though, is when you have infinite poison imbuement, you can chain it additional hits of the Bursting Venoms aspect. And oftentimes, once you get one trigger of this, it's just chaining into more and more triggers, which is absolutely insane. This is really what amps up the single target boss damage, but also it actually procs quite frequently when you're hitting multiple enemies at a time. And so you can actually get a lot of extra procs out of poison imbuement just clearing a standard dungeon. Then we have the imitated imbuement aspect, which is going to give our shadow clones mimicking the imbuements that we apply. And when we cast an imbuement skill, we're going to give our active shadow clone increased damage. So when we have infinite poison imbuement, we spam it out, giving our shadow clone more damage, and they're going to trigger their imbuements at the same time, giving us double infinite poison imbuement damage, which is insanely good. Then for the last 2 aspects, we have first the conceited one. This is only good because we have Temerity, giving us permanent barrier, giving us just a straight up damage increase. If you don't have Temerity, then you're going to want to run a different aspect. And lastly, I'm running the accelerating aspect here. However, Edge Masters was the one that I was running previously, and if you happen to have a good Edge Masters, then you can run this. However, I did replace my Edge Masters while it was disabled, but now it is re-enabled, so I would definitely recommend Edge Masters if you can get a good one. Now, I want to mention a few of the stats so that you all can kind of prioritize the stats that really matter. First off, on the helmet, ranks of poison imbuement is going to be extremely important. Same with cooldown reduction. Those are the 2 most important. Also, maximum life in general just works really well with this build because it increases the Temerity shield and also gives you more effective HP with the additional scaling of armor and damage reduction. On the chest piece, you just want to get as much damage reduction as possible. Same with your pants if you're not running Temerity. For your gloves, definitely want critical strike chance and ranks of twisting blades. For your boots, ranks of dash and energy cost reduction. If you're gonna put points into dash, then you can run something else, but I oftentimes like to find the dash on my boots so I can use that skill point for another passive. And energy cost reduction is gonna be extremely important. Crossbow, you're gonna want vulnerable damage, you're gonna want core skill damage, you're gonna want that type of stuff, critical strike damage, anything like that. For your amulet, you're gonna want ranks of all imbuement skills, and then I actually like a passive upgrade. So I ran with ranks of malice passive, but if you get ranks of weapon mastery, that's also very good. Also, damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, that's really, really powerful because we're going to constantly be poisoning. And energy cost reduction. Energy cost reduction on any piece that you can get it is going to be huge. For the rings, you're going to want critical strike damage and critical strike chance. And if you can get it, maybe a little bit of additional resource generation or potentially maximum life. But honestly, those ones matter significantly less, and there's actually some potential better stats. Realistically, you want critical strike chance and critical strike damage. Those are the 1 and 2 for your rings. Then for the weapons, again, you're going to want, oftentimes, I prefer swords for the critical strike damage trigger. However, close damage actually ends up being a little bit better, and the dagger attack speed actually ends up being a little bit better if you can proc the poison imbuement infinite charges. So daggers are actually something that I enjoy a little bit more when it comes to bosses, and then swords are a little bit better for when it comes to clearing trash. So generally I lean towards daggers because, well, getting that extra damage towards elites and bosses is going to be super, super powerful. In terms of gems, I want rupees in the armor pieces, skulls in the jewelry, and emeralds in the weapons. Emeralds is going to give us extra critical strike damage. Rubies are going to give us extra maximum life for temerity, extra value, and then skulls are just going to give that extra armor so that it scales with the chain or the disobedience aspect, and overall it's just going to be a very, very powerful way to increase your damage resistance. Now, as for the specializations and the Paragon, first off, specializations, I oftentimes swap between preparation and inner sight. Now, I was running combo points, but what I found is when you start to reach higher tiers, it's kind of awkward kind of building up combo points and then trying to reach 3. You can actually do combo points, and if you want, you can run condemnation if you're going to run combo points, and that's actually a really, really nice combination. But if you're going to do that, you kind of want to stack up 3 combo points. I prefer preparation, because preparation is going to give me that shadow clone burst, allowing me to nuke down whenever I want, and then allowing me to do potential double charges of poison imbuement, and then use that attack to go ahead and reset my shadow clone cooldown, which is going to be very, very powerful. And then inner sight has always just been the best boss damage specialization, so I recommend that. As for Paragon here, well, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I do want to go over some of the glyphs and some of the legendary nodes that we're picking up. First off, closer glyph. This is going to be super important for extra melee damage reduction and giving us extra cutthroat skill damage. The second glyph here we're going to be running is going to be exploit. This is critical because it's going to give us vulnerable application towards everyone in the area in order for us to just get some extra value when we're killing off packs. So you don't have to basic every single individual common mob. You can just hit them with a skill and you're going to apply vulnerable. Then we have the next board and glyph, which is going to be the critical strike damage combat glyph. This is going to give us a massive, massive additional critical strike damage with our core skills. And more importantly, going to give us extra energy cost back whenever we critically strike, which is really, really powerful. And we're going to get the exploit weakness legendary node for additional damage against vulnerable enemies. This is going to really, really ramp up against bosses and single target characters. Next glyph is going to be the tracker glyph. This is going to give us extra damage to poison targets, and we're going to get our poison damage effect lasting 33% longer, which is going to pair really well with the poison imbuement and mimic poison imbuement. And we're also going to go for the legendary node Tricks of the Trade. With our puncture skill, when we cast puncture, it's going to give our next twisting blades 25% increased damage. You're going to want to try to use your twisting blades as soon as you use your basic, because if you use something like, let's say your shadow step or dash, you're actually going to trigger that and use the Tricks of the Trade proc on that instead. And lastly, our last glyph is going to be the turf glyph, giving us extra damage reduction against close enemies and damage to close enemies. One quick mention here, I've seen a lot of people ask about, okay, why are we not going for the bonuses on the glyphs? What's going on here? You're going to need to get to rank 15 oftentimes to get the bonuses that you're going to need for each different scenario, okay? Now, so for example, if you want the strength bonus or whatever, when I put the Paragon points in, I consider a rank 15 glyph with 4 radius. If you don't have the 4 radius, then you can kind of modify your points temporarily until you get that 4 radius at level 15 glyphs. So I went ahead and jumped into a tier 60 nightmare dungeon just to showcase kind of what this looks like. Now, when you're in a tier 60, pretty much all builds do take some damage, some amount of pretty brutal damage. And in this one in particular, we actually take a ton of poison damage. So fortunately for us, with our barrier, we're going to be able to kind of absorb a lot of that. But oftentimes what you're going to want to do with this build is kind of just pop Shadow Clone when we get to massive elite packs. And in fact, in a situation like this, we're going to pop the kind of barrier, we're going to pop our Shadow Clone, and we're going to go to town. You can see in the bottom portion of the screen, you can see that my poison imbuement's actually glowing. And the key with that is that means it's giving us infinite poison imbuement triggers, which means I can constantly activate it in order for us to get increased shadow clone damage, and of course, giving us the infinite poison imbuement triggers, which is very, very important. You might also have noticed that I was constantly full HP poisoned there, and well, that doesn't necessarily matter because of our lifesteal, well, I shouldn't say lifesteal, but our siphoning strikes triggers coming off when we crit close enemies. And you can see even at tier 60, I'm not even using any of my mobility skills here, which you're going to want to do. You do not want to stand in place like I just showed you there, unless it's like a really, really massive hit. You want to use your mobility skills to kind of puncture people and then pull your twisting blades through them in order to get some extra value. But just to showcase what the tankiness of this build looks like, you can see that it's very, very tanky, and yet also does insane amounts of DPS at a tier 60 here. And of course, when we get to the elites, you can see absolutely annihilating them with the poison imbuement triggers, and you can actually back off and not worry about it at all in terms of not having to kind of stay in the fight. You can just let the poison imbuement do the rest of the damage. Now this dungeon in particular, Blind Burrows, has a lot of poison damage, so you might see me take a lot of extra damage just from the poison triggers, well, that's just the nature of this dungeon. But fortunately for us, we have enough healing in our kit, and oftentimes our potion triggers that we don't have to worry about it too much, but you do want to be careful and make sure that, well, you're not going to get murdered by the poison damage, so just keep that in mind, okay? So really, really big damage, really, really consistent damage. And again, you don't actually have to stay in these fights. Once you proc your poison imbuement, you can actually jump around and pull that through towards other enemies and deal a lot of damage that way. For example, here you can see me, I just pulled the poison imbuement through, and you can see I can just kind of walk away and let the poison imbuement do all the damage, because that is what does basically, I would say 70 to 80% of your DPS if you're playing the build with a poison imbuement focus. Obviously, you could kind of stay in the fights if you want and do a little bit more damage with your twisting blades, but oftentimes you don't need to. Do not need to, and it is very, very good to do so. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip ahead and find a couple bosses, because that's where the build really shines. So we're arriving at the boss here, and you can actually see at the bottom, I have poison imbuement pre-triggered. Whenever you're going into a battle, you can actually pre-trigger your poison imbuement to give you the 2 stacks beforehand, and then you can let the cooldown recharge before you actually fight. And when you're going into battle, my recommendation is proc Shadow Clone beforehand, and then proc your second form of poison imbuement. And you can see here, I got that infinite poison imbuement, and you can just see the amount of poison damage that we're dealing. That was about, what, like a 5-6 second boss fight at tier 60. Easy peasy, 0 deaths, as you can see in the right hand side, and I had 0 struggle. I was recording, I wasn't really paying attention to the actual mechanics, and I just blasted my way through it. This is by far my favorite rogue build that I've played with so far. Perhaps there's going to be one in the future, but as for the best build, the one that I choose to run, Death Trap, very solid build, penetrating shot, also a very, very good ranged build. This build, however, is the one that I typically choose to pick to try to do basically 99% of my content. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all in the next one.